How's it going, teachers? Today I want to go through the second part of my demand lesson plan. So we're going to do a little video lesson plan here on how I introduce the big concept of determinants of demand. When I teach this lesson, usually I'll go back and do a little bit of review from the previous lesson. So we want to make sure before we start talking about determinants that the kids have kind of wrapped their heads around the concepts of movement and shifts and make sure that they can recognize the difference between a movement along the demand curve and a shift in the demand curve. So I'll usually put up something pretty similar to what we went over in the last video, illustrating for them so they can visually see what a movement left and a movement right looks like compared to a shift left and a shift right. And then we'll also briefly go back over what causes movements along the demand curve, in this case changes in price and changes in supply. Now, since we haven't introduced supply at this point, I'll generally just tell them that a movement left along the demand curve happens when you have a leftward shift in the supply curve, and a rightward movement along the demand curve occurs when you have a rightward shift in the supply curve. They don't really know exactly what that means yet, but if they write it in their notes, then by the time we get to supply in the next lesson, they'll at least be able to go back, and it will make sense to them when they go back over their notes in a way it may not 100% make sense of them today, especially since we don't have the supply curve there, so they can't actually see it shifting. So I kind of give them that information, but for future use, if it confuses them, you certainly don't have to provide that information for them. You could go back and fill it in later. The reason I like to do it this way is I like to contrast the movements and what causes movements to happen alongside what causes shifts in demand to happen. So we didn't cover in the last video what causes shifts in demand. Those are going to be your 5 determinants of demand, and that's the main focus of our lesson plan. I'll spend 5 or 10 minutes kind of rehashing last lesson. Then I'll move on to today's topic. So without further ado, let's run into the determinants of demand. So when teaching the kids about the determinants of demand, I found that one of the biggest difficulties kids have is just memorizing exactly what those determinants are. So a couple of years ago, I ran into somebody who had the kids memorize the acronym MERIT. So what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about the determinants of demand as they're presented in the textbook, and then as we go through that, we're going to build letter by letter the acronym MERIT so that that's something that the kids, I think it's a little bit easier to memorize MERIT than it is to memorize, change in the number of consumers. So as we go through this, we're going to build it. Spoiler alert, it's going to spell MERIT by the time we're done. So determinant of demand number 1 that we cover here is a change in the number of consumers in the marketplace. So that we can get an M for merit, we can rename this one market size if you'd like. So market size is going to have an impact. This is probably the one kids have the least difficulty with. It's a relatively straightforward and relatively obvious one. So all we need to tell the kids is that if there's an increase in the number of consumers in the market, more people demand more products, and kids generally have an easy time with that. If for some reason we had a reduction in consumers in the marketplace, then we would have less demand. So more consumers leads to a rightward shift in the demand curve, and less consumers leads to a leftward shift in the demand curve. Usually when I give this example, we talk about it, I'll usually default to like immigration levels or something like that to kind of give them a real world example of this. But there's certainly other ways you can go about doing that. I know a teacher that likes to introduce the zombie apocalypse and go with kind of a Walking Dead themed one. Anything that causes either more or less people to be available in your marketplace is going to affect overall demand for products. The second big one that we talk about, and this is one you're going to want to emphasize, is a determinant not only of demand, but it's going to be a determinant of almost everything for the remainder of the year. So this is one that's going to come up again and again and again, is changes in future expectations. Now, there's no hard and fast rule for this, like when future expectations do one thing, it shifts right, and when future expectations do another thing, demand shifts to the left. This is one they're going to kind of have to work out for themselves kind of logically. But basically, you want to tell the kids that the purchasing decisions that they make today is based at least part on what they expect to happen in the foreseeable future and what they think their needs are going to be in the foreseeable future. Usually the example that I go with here as I talk about iPhones, if you're not familiar, iPhones generally release the new iPhone in September. And so I'll ask the kids, what happens to iPhone sales in August? And they have no idea. But then I'm like, if you expect the new model of the iPhone to come out next month, how many people are going to go out and buy the iPhone this month? And none of them raise their hand. They're like, no, we don't want the current generation iPhone if we think we only have to wait a couple of weeks to get a better, shinier, faster processored one. So we'll use that example of I'm not going to purchase an iPhone today if I expect a newer, better iPhone to be out next month, whereas I might purchase a new iPhone today if I don't expect that other one to come out for a year or for 6 months or something like that. So give them some example where they either put off purchasing a product today based on what they think is going to happen in the future, or you could use the alternate example where they have to buy something now that they may not need based on their future expectations as well. I'd like to introduce at this point the concept of the business cycle, kind of cycle back to the business cycle from Module 1 and Module 2 here. So we like to talk about, we actually have a way to measure people's future expectations. It's what's called the Consumer Confidence Index, and it's something that macroeconomists especially like to look to when predicting what's going to happen to GDP growth going in the future. We'll ask people, how do they feel about their current situation? Do they feel stable? Are their feelings for the future positive? Are they negative? And that's going to impact what they're going to do today and their purchasing numbers today. So people who feel like the future is generally rosy and they're going to have a better job or the same job, maybe make a little more money, they tend to make big expensive purchases today based on those projections, whereas people who are a little bit more bearish on the future might put off those large expensive purchases because they feel like the future may not be as good as the current is for them. So you want to point out that this is what's called the Consumer Confidence Index, and it's basically the mathematical way that we quantify future expectations, which helps us to predict what consumer behavior is going to be like going forward. The last of the ones on this page, which is determinant number 3, is, I think, by a fairly wide margin, the most complicated determinant for students to wrap their head around, and that is changes in the price of related goods. So in order to understand, before we even start to graph this thing, they need to understand that there's basically 2 types of relationships that goods can have in our macroeconomics course. Goods can either be complementary goods or they can be substitute goods. And not all goods are complementary goods or substitute goods, but certain pairs of goods fit one description or the other. So we'll tell them that complementary goods are goods that are, generally speaking, purchased together. So things like milk and cereal, or cars and tires, or socks and shoes. And that if you are not able to purchase one of these products, or you choose not to purchase one of these products, generally speaking, you don't want the other product as well. So, if you're not purchasing shoes, you don't have a whole lot of use for socks. On the other side of that, we have substitute goods, which are goods that are bought in place of each other. And these are generally 2 different versions of the same product, right? I can buy white bread or I can buy wheat bread, but I probably don't buy both of those things. I can buy Coke or I can buy Pepsi, but I'm probably not shopping for both of those as well. The key to understanding the relationship between the goods is basically to tell the kids and have them memorize that for complementary goods, a movement on one side of the complementary good is going to cause a shift in its complement in the same direction. So a rightward movement would cause a rightward shift in the other good, and vice versa. And that for substitute goods, a movement on one of the substitute goods would lead to a shift in the other good, but in the opposite direction. So complements go together, whereas substitutes do the opposite. They have an inverse relationship. We'll see what this looks like on the next slide. So carrying over our example from the previous slide, we have one pair of complementary goods and one pair of substitute goods here. For our complementary goods, I've chosen milk and cereal. That's kind of the easiest one, something that most kids can understand. So what I have happening here in our version of things is I have the price of milk going up. So there's a shortage of milk, and H-E-B is going to raise the price of milk. The key component that the kids need to see is that when the price of milk goes up, there's a movement along the demand curve for milk, resulting in fewer people purchasing milk. So the quantity of milk is going to fall. In this case, quantity demanded of milk is going to fall. On its complement for cereal, since there are fewer people purchasing milk and milk and cereal go together in tandem, I'll then point out that all those people who would have bought milk at the lower price point and didn't because the price of milk went up, all of those people are basically removed from the market for cereal. If I cannot afford milk, I'm not interested in purchasing cereal at all. And so while there's a movement on the demand curve for milk, there's actually going to be a shift in the same direction in the demand curve for cereal. So a leftward movement in milk leads to a leftward shift in cereal because milk and cereal are complementary goods. On the other side, for substitute goods, I'll usually rile the kids up by talking about Coke and Pepsi. For some reason, they tend to have really strong opinions about this one way or the other. And in our scenario here, we have the price of Coke going up, exactly like what happened to milk, resulting in fewer people purchasing Coke. This is, however, going to have the opposite impact on the market for Pepsi, as if people can no longer afford Coke, they still want cola, they still want soda to take home from the grocery store. And so if Coke becomes more expensive, they'll just move and purchase Pepsi instead. If you want to get really advanced with the kids, this is the point where you can talk about chain CPI, especially if you're an AP government teacher and you want to talk about how inflation is calculated for Social Security. One of the big changes they made is moving to what's called chained CPI, where they presume that people will make these types of substitutions on their own. Basically, long story short, it results in lower inflation rates and lower cost of living adjustments because we're going to presume that people are naturally going to purchase less expensive products or less expensive goods. So, in their estimation, if beef becomes more expensive, they're just going to presume that people are going to buy chicken or pork instead, thus resulting in lower overall increases in cost of living. You certainly don't have to go into that with the kids, but especially if you teach government and you want to talk about changes that have happened in the recent past, movement to chain CPI is certainly something that you could tell the kids about. It's something that was discussed for quite a while. The fourth of our determinants is going to be change in consumer incomes. And this one is relatively easy for the kids to understand usually. The only thing they have a little bit of difficulty with is kind of wrapping their head around the concept of an inferior good. They understand normal goods and that normal goods have a direct relationship with income because if they have a higher income, they go out and they buy more stuff in general. However, we need to make sure that they understand what an inferior good is. I'll usually describe it as, the store brand of something or a generic version of it. The actual definition is that an inferior good is a good you purchase because of its price. If I'm only buying this good because it's a low price, then when I have additional income, I don't necessarily go out of my way to buy cheaper stuff if my income goes up. And so demand for inferior goods has the opposite relationship with income that demand for normal goods would have. So you could say, Kraft macaroni and cheese versus Hill Country Fare macaroni and cheese, or, Dr. Pepper versus Dr. Thunder, which is the example we used here. Any number of things, Nikes versus Payless shoes. But what they need to understand is that for most products in the marketplace, if people's incomes rise across the board, usually as the result of, an economic upturn or, maybe a tax rebate or something like that, they'll go out of their way to purchase more normal goods, but they will stop purchasing inferior goods because instead of buying the inferior goods, they're going to buy the good stuff. And vice versa here would also be true. So when incomes fall, that's bad for producers of normal goods, but actually a good thing for producers of inferior goods. Last but not least, our fifth determinant of demand is going to be changes in consumer tastes. Some textbooks call this trends in the marketplace. Either way, it starts with the T, so it works with our acronym regardless of whether you want to go with tastes or trends. I usually write both on the board just so that they know that they're essentially the same thing. This one is actually usually pretty easy for the kids to understand because they've gone through multiple different trends in their lifetime, right? I'll usually ask them, what is something that was popular to them when they were in middle school that's not popular today, and they can list probably any number of things. The cool thing about trends, or the difficult thing about trends, depending on how you look at it, is that there's not really a rhyme or reason for these consumer taste changes. It's just sometimes society decides we like things, or sometimes we decide we no longer like things, and these things are very difficult to predict. So there's no kind of pattern, and there's really no relationship. When X, Y, and Z happens, then trends for this product will cause demand to go up. They just need to understand that sometimes we just decide we like or don't like things, and that's going to impact overall demand for whatever product it is we're talking about. So in my example here, I'm going with bell bottoms. In 1973, bell bottoms were all the rage. 2017, not so much. It's the exact same product. Nothing tangible happened. It's just people wanted bell bottoms in 73 and don't really want them in 2017. There's not really a rhyme or reason to that. So when we wrap this whole thing up, hopefully we've been spelling this word correctly. We do it in this particular order so that it spells out merit at the end of our notes. And so we have market size, expectations, related goods, income, and tastes. And those things together are the 5 main determinants of demand. If you do it this way, I think the kids are going to have a little bit easier time memorizing merit. They'll definitely memorize the acronym. Whether or not they know exactly what each of the letters stands for is something that certainly you're going to have to test. Maybe quiz them in the following class period to get them some practice here. So each of these things is very important for them to know. I'll usually spend one day introducing this concept, keeping in mind I have 48-minute classes, and then spend an entire another class period practicing, so giving them various scenarios and asking them to draw demand curves showing exactly what's happening here. So it's something that requires a little bit of practice. I don't know if the concepts themselves are particularly difficult, with the exception maybe of the price of related goods. That one's a bit complex. But having them draw it out and having them do the practice over and over and over again is the best way to make sure that they understand these concepts. Thank you very much, and I'll see you tomorrow.